Hey everybody, welcome back to Backlog Banter. I'm your boy Abram, joined as usual by Tucker Hazel, and we're here today to talk about video games.
Yeah.
And
All right. I'll do it for once. As a little treat.
As a little treat, as a little break from usual content. We're here to talk
Yeah.
about games. We're here to talk about games as an extra special treat.
Yes.
On a higher abstracted level, which
Yippee!
we typically never do here. And we're going to be investigating this interesting idea of post-launch context
Yes.
being more important than pre-launch context.
Yeah.
So let me give you just a quick example to set the stage, and then Tucker's going to take over because it's really his idea.
Yeah.
But if you imagine Ocarina of Time, you've probably heard of it. There is the
Let me check.
context.
Yes.
You got it? You remember that one? There's a context of everything that released before Ocarina of Time, which formed the game's typically discussed legacy of, bringing gaming into 3D with new innovations like Z-targeting and what have you.
Harold Field.
But then there is the context of everything that's happened since Ocarina of Time to our current moment.
Yeah.
And Mr. Tucker Hazel believes that context, everything after Ocarina of Time,
Or insert any game here.
Yes.
Yes.
On-
We're not specifically talking about Ocarina of Time today. That was just an example. To be clear.
that post-launch context ought to be what defines the current understanding of classic games, opposed of any game.
Yes.
Opposed to the context of what led up to that game's launch.
Exactly.
Did I have that
Yes.
mostly
No.
clear?
We got through it together. I helped.
fair enough.
I helped steer the course just a little bit.
Yeah.
But yes, and this is framed as we're going to discuss through the elements that shape a game's perception and experience when it comes out. Talking about just the middle of the timeline there. Pre-launch is the game is how long has it been since it's been announced? What games did that developer make before that? This game is currently the top of its class in terms of game design.
Yeah.
It is reshaping the industry, or not reshaping the industry. Of course, there are plenty of games that don't, but it's the newest thing, and reviews are coming out, and it's new. And then everything past that, and of course, it's an evolving spectrum.
Yeah.
Nothing. There's no hard cutoff where suddenly game becomes other game, but after the game comes out, its legacy starts to shape. It starts to influence other things. It might get patches, especially in the current day. It might get DLC. Sequels will start to come out. Things that might have been unique to that game in terms of its design might proliferate to other games, other genres. Post it coming out, it's not the new thing anymore. It's not the height of technology. There are other things that have happened since then. And so my thesis, and it took us a while to nail this down. We tried this video twice before actually getting here. And we'll see if this one sticks. Is that when discussing a game today, I think it's more important to talk about it in the context of the things that have come after it and how that shapes the experience of playing a game in the modern day rather than approaching a game from its launch context. Specifically because I think that it, in good faith, is basically impossible to properly recreate the scenario where you would be able to experience a game in its launch context. Doesn't matter how long it's been time since that. And it's not the new thing anymore. You know what the reviews were. You know if it won awards or not. You know if it's gotten patches or not. That is the context that you have to play a game. And especially if you are into games culture as we are. If you're interested in researching the history and the legacy of developers and genres and series, you're going to have a lot of information sitting in your mind when you're going back to an older game. You're thinking about, this was received in this way when it came out, and then suddenly people don't really like it because another sequel came out, or it got replaced by something, or this has aged poorly or aged well. These are all sitting in your mind when you're playing a game older than it just releasing at any given point in time. And so I think that the hard part becomes that usually when people discuss games, they're talking about it from that launch era perspective. A lot of the greatest games of all time, and I'm not disputing their legacy or their quality necessarily, but they're talked about from, look how popular Mario 3, for example, was when it came out. Look how revolutionary Mario 64 was when it came out. There hadn't been a 3D Mario to that point. And I think that's a great element of a game's legacy, of a game's conversation. It absolutely should be talked about. But I place, for me, more emphasis on how have things shifted since that comes out, because that's the context in which, for me, as someone my age, that's the context I'm playing it in. And I want to be able to bring in the fact that maybe this doesn't feel so unique anymore. Maybe this has aged poorly or aged well or whatever it is into the conversation. And of course, no one's telling me I can't. But I think that is, for me, more interesting to place a game in modern context and talk about how things have evolved since it comes out than playing the, I think, interesting, but for me, not particularly important thought experiment of what was it like when it came out.
Yeah.
That's something I find it very hard to put myself in the shoes of even if it were games that came out in 2011 and I was really not playing many games in 2011.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to put, and maybe that's an intellectual failing on my part. It's totally possible, but
let me hit you with a question.
Yes.
Let me hit you with a question. Because I think when people hear this argument that you make, they ask what I think is the obvious rebuttal. Well, if you're looking at Ocarina of Time, how can you put Ocarina of Time in a 2024 context when Ocarina of Time wasn't built for that?
Yeah,
couldn't possibly have anticipated that.
Absolutely.
What do you say to those sorts of counterpoints that you must look at the game at least to some prevailing degree as its status as a N64 cartridge released in 1998 because it simply is not a game that released in 2024.
Sure. Yeah, I think that this brings in another dichotomy. Is the experience of playing a game or the what's the other word? What's the other side of that coin? Because I think I place more emphasis, especially in my criticism of any given game, in my analysis of any given game, on the experience of playing it. And I don't.
You're basically talking about the experience of playing it or the intellectual understanding of it.
Correct. Yeah. Which is the intellectual understanding is yes. Obviously, Ocarina of Time was not made for 2024 context, and it's not. I don't think it's fair or unfair to approach a game from either way. But it's certainly not. It wouldn't be fair to only approach it from the playing it now perspective. You got to go in with some knowledge of this wasn't designed for current context because it wasn't designed in the current context, and it's not X Games' fault that what it inspired to all sorts of other games is suddenly not as interesting anymore. But for me, it's not an either or.
Sure.
I place more emphasis on one than the other.
Yeah.
But I think that bringing in the knowledge that things have evolved is, I think, the more realistic context of that is how people are playing the game. That is an inescapable reality. As I said, I think it is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to truly experience a game in its launch context, outside of its launch context. And I feel that usually that evolving legacy is in discussion supplanted by that pre-launch. The post-launch context is usually supplanted by the pre-launch context.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it from the context which it came out, and the experience of playing it today is less important, and I feel, in some of these larger conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a tricky conversation to have because in some ways, I mean, I've known you for a long time.
Yeah.
I know that there's certain games you have particular vendettas towards.
We don't necessarily need to get
we
into
don't
big
need
games,
to,
no.
but the reason I say this is because where it gets tricky is that a lot of the games that have these legendary statuses. I'll just say Ocarina of Time. I'll just say Super Metroid. It's just on the top of my head. It's unrelated.
Two games I like.
And unrelated to you, unrelated to anything. It popped in my head for whatever reason. To a lot of people who are going to revisit those games or play them new are going to love them because they'll consider them to be great games experientially. Sure. You know, I'll give you an example of Ocarina of Time. I think I played it first on Wii Virtual Console, but where I really played it in a thorough way is when I got my 3DS in 2011.
Ocarina of Time 3D.
Played Ocarina of Time 3D.
Yeah.
And I had a great time with the game. Sure. And so...
I like that game.
Yeah, and I'm not saying you don't like the game, but what I'm saying is that I think a lot of the games that hold up in this way, that are spoken about in this way, are still just fun to play.
Sure.
For a lot of people.
Yeah, sure.
And there's a lot of games that come out now that I just don't like.
Yeah.
And so I think there's an inescapable dimension of preference to the conversation, too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that is something that I don't want to diminish, because what I'm trying to do is present my case for why I approach games in the way that I do.
Yeah.
And I know that that's not shared by many people, which I think is why I wanted to break this down. And I have a bunch of points of, okay, this is why I feel this way, this is why I feel this way. Because I kind of feel like I'm either alone in this, or it's something that's not discussed particularly often. Yeah. So I just think it's interesting to talk about.
Well, let me suggest this to you.
Yeah.
I would put forth that most people feel the way you do.
Okay.
If you look at people who play games on the whole.
Yes.
I'll give you an anecdote, which is not massively helpful, but I think it'll help you a little bit. I was
Thanks.
playing Mario Party with Jean and with my sister.
The first game?
Well, I'm just saying Mario Party in general. So I'm going to make a larger
You
point.
played the series with your family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We were playing Mario Party Superstars, and then we're like, well, let's play. I was like, well, we can play some other Mario Party stuff. So I launched Mario Party 2 on NSO, and immediately my sister has no interest in the game. It's old.
Yeah.
It's boring.
Yeah.
Why can't we just play the new HD, easy to understand new game?
Yeah.
I think that your average person playing video games feels that way.
Sure. I think that is a very likely thing to assume. Yeah.
And I just raise that because
Yeah.
I find your perspective on this to be very interesting because I know you play games a lot for research,
Yes.
ostensibly.
Yeah.
So, like, you were playing the other day while I was playing Destiny, you were playing Personal Trainer Math.
I was.
And you were playing Personal Trainer
Yes.
Math. If I'm not incorrect here,
Make any assessment you want. It's probably true.
because of its launch context. You were
Yeah.
playing it because it was interesting. Nintendo launched the
Sure.
game in that way.
Yeah.
You weren't playing it because you're applying your modern sensibilities, just
Yeah,
thinking,
yeah.
oh, I'm going to like this game, or I'm going to draw an
Yeah.
assessment about Personal Trainer Math
Yeah.
because of where it sits in the modern era. You were playing it
It
because
doesn't
it's-
sit in the modern era.
Right. And so I'm curious where this squares for you and really exactly what you're trying to challenge, because I think that most people, just your average game fan,
Yeah.
or your average fan of any kind of entertainment, gravitate towards the new thing.
No, definitely.
And
yes.
but you approach games from an academic context, but you still prefer to heavily weigh your experiential
Yeah.
context opposed to the historical one, despite
Yeah.
you being so interested in that.
Well, I'm a man of two minds.
Sure,
Inside of
that's-
Tucker, there are two Tuckers.
yeah.
And inside of you, I hope there are no Tuckers. I am fascinated with video games from an intellectual point of view. What's the history of them?
Yeah.
Who made the game? What were the development decisions that went into making it? Whether that is production reality or genre reality. What was the design doc that went into making this? That let it be greenlit? That let it come out? That let it influence other things?
For sure.
I find that immensely fascinating,
Yeah.
and especially for weirder corners of the games industry, like Personal Trainer Math, which you can easily imagine the design doc for that math shit. Do some fucking math problems.
Right.
And we'll put it on the DS because it's going to sell copies to people that don't like traditional video games. And that's it. And that's pretty easy to lock down on, which is why I played it for 35 minutes. And I got no interest in going back to it. I have a good encapsulation.
Yeah.
But the other Tucker is I'm fascinated with video games from, believe it or not, my own point of view.
Yeah.
Of playing through a game and feeling a certain way about a design element, about a genre, about the way a game has aged or compares to other games in said genre. I'm equally fascinated by that. And that's also where I think it's a lot easier for me to talk about games from that perspective because everyone can talk about their experience with the game. Not everyone is as nerdy as I am and wants to do the research about the context, about the sales figures, about the when was it announced at what E3 and then what the trailers that led up to it. Like, I do this shit all the time. But frankly, no one else does. And so when I'm approaching a conversation, I largely, unless I can bring in some interesting historical context, I leave aside the intellectual Tucker. And experiential Tucker shows up because I can talk about my feelings on a game's design element or how anything made me feel in my experience with it without feeling like the other person is, I don't know, maybe like at a disadvantage in terms of the historical knowledge because I don't come into any given conversation expecting someone else to know the other stuff that I know of when it came out, how many other games were published around it by the same company. Like I'm too into this shit, and so I kind of leave that as my like researching on my own time versus having conversations. And most of the conversations we have are actually, I'm not sure that's true, but a lot of the conversations we have are about
You
about
and I,
our,
we? Or,
you and me, we.
Yeah.
About our experience with the game. Like, how did we feel about this? How did the evolution of this make us feel? So, that's why I don't really weigh the intellectual side of it in conversation because I think, in large part, it's usually not relevant when I'm talking to people about game design and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, I agree. Like, I play a lot of older games, and whenever I'm going to start a game, first thing I always do,
Yeah.
I look up how long is it going to take me to beat it.
Of course.
I check HLTV and then I go to YouTube and I type in long
Yes.
play. I never go into a game removed from any context. And by and large, I don't really play random stuff.
Yeah.
You know, I usually am going into something that is understood, or if it's something niche, it's because I've been learning about it already.
yeah.
So unless I'm literally playing a game at midnight as it releases, I've not really been paying attention to the marketing, which again is also rarely never.
Yeah.
I basically always know what I'm gonna.
Yeah, it's never like you've
Yeah.
seen the trailers. You know you're excited about
Yeah.
it because of the trailers and
Yeah.
things like that. Yeah.
So the experience is very important, but I also don't. I think you have to bear that academic context in mind. In
Okay.
my opinion,
Yeah.
I think you always should. I think I think it should be true of whether you're reading a book, whether you're watching a film, whether you're listening to an album or you're playing a game. We are talking to a very specific group of people.
Yes.
If I'm talking to somebody random about games removed from our circles,
Yeah.
then it's a casual conversation.
Yeah.
But we're talking about a very hardcore circle.
definitely, yeah.
And I feel like in our circles, it's important to weigh both of those contexts
Absolutely.
very heavily.
Yeah, sure.
Would you say that you would agree with that when you're
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about you're really in the
Definitely.
really in the zone here?
Definitely,
Yeah.
and especially when it comes to like you and me talking or me and
Yeah.
Bo talking, I know you guys know about
Yeah.
that, and so it's usually in the context of us talking, we have the same knowledge base. I don't
Yeah.
need to bring up that X game launched in X
Yeah.
context because I know you also are aware of it, and so it's usually just kind of like a baseline knowledge,
Sure.
and then I think we build on top of that with our experiential conversation because usually where it's hard to disagree, you can't disagree on historical context stuff.
Yeah.
Where you disagree and where I think conversations become more interesting is in how did you feel about this different than I felt about this, and so I still think it's actually it actually ends up being more of the conversation to
Yeah.
weigh your experience versus the historical value.
I mean, it's not a good idea generally to make the case for a game simply by stating what could be true on the back of the box.
Mm-hmm.
This game introduced this idea, this game sold this many units.
Yeah.
That's really not useful when you're talking about what a game means to a person.
Yeah.
But when you're thinking about legacy,
Yeah.
in my opinion, I think legacy is about something much greater than an individual person's appraisal of a game.
Yeah.
And so when I'm thinking about
Yeah, that's fair enough.
games historically and I'm thinking about their legacy,
Mm-hmm.
to me I hold that in a very different part of my brain than how I feel about a game.
Yeah.
There's games that have incredible legacies. I'll give you a good example, original Metal Gear Solid. A game we both don't like. I played Metal Gear Solid. I think I get to that tank. We gotta throw the chaff grenades at it. I'm like, I think this is really hard to control. I don't have fun, so I stop.
Yeah.
But to me, that's not an indictment on the legacy of Metal Gear.
Sure.
Would you say, in your mind, that the legacy and the personal experience ought to be held differently as I do, or should they be one and the same?
Yeah. I think that's interesting because we were talking about a couple of games. We mentioned Ocarina of Time. We mentioned
Yeah.
Mario 64. We mentioned Mario 3. These are games that are largely considered some of the best games of all
Yeah.
time. They're also 3 games that I've played extensively, or in some of the cases beaten.
Yeah.
And have personal feelings on their design, on my experience with them. And I think what's interesting is I think you bring up a good point, and I think maybe the reason why the post-launch information, because bringing it back to the pre-launch, post-launch stuff, why the post-launch element is not brought up as much in the conversation about games that we're talking about of why is Ocarina of Time considered one of the greatest games of all time, is that it's easier to make the argument for the historical context of it because that is largely indisputable.
Yeah.
You can't disagree that it was the first 3D Zelda game. You can't disagree that it helped to pioneer Z-targeting. And those are 2 very important things and are 2 of the most important things to that game specifically. But then when it comes to everything else after that, it becomes a little bit more muddy. Did you play it at launch?
Yeah.
Do you enjoy that genre? Is the way that you played it on original hardware? Did you emulate it? Do you save states? The conversation around a game becomes murkier and more fractured as things go along, and so it's harder to make an argument any given way when there's 400 possibilities of how someone could feel in different contexts of different times about a game after it came out versus the much more limited pool of this is the stuff we have to agree on.
Yeah.
For when a game came out, how it was received at launch. These are things that are pretty much set in stone. And so I think that I end up making this argument because I feel that the post-launch element is under-discussed, not necessarily, and I think maybe I need to reframe a little bit of what I said earlier, not necessarily that, especially in the context of a game being one of the greatest games of all time, that it should outweigh the agreed-upon historical context elements, pre-launch elements, but that there still is a space, and I think a very big value in reevaluating games, in approaching them from a modern context, and allowing yourself to recognize the fracturing of biases and taste and evolution of game design and things that go into playing a game today. Because at the end of the day, I'm obsessed with games history, but the experience of interacting with the interactive medium of art or of video games is what I'm more interested in. That's what's more important to me, is what is it like to play the game? And that is something that becomes more and more muddied and fractured, and lots of different possible experiences it evolve over time.
I mean, I agree with you. I mean, most of my writing about games, and the writing I'm most interested in commissioning or whatever, is about a more like almost anthropomorphic understanding of games.
Yeah.
Because it's a different conversation, but I just don't feel like a lot of games have a ton of intrinsic meaning in the same way that like film does. The way you could watch a movie and take away a message that applies larger than the game.
Sure.
Especially with a lot of games I play, Nintendo games. Wii Sports Resort is a game that has no intrinsic meaning.
Yeah.
That meaning is all made, in my opinion, between the game and the player.
Oh, definitely, absolutely.
And those are
video games are specifically good at that.
Yeah, 100%. And so me, and when I'm thinking about my studies into games, it's through that lens. Yeah. So I agree with you in part, I think, or even.
By the way, you said anthropomorphic. I think you meant anthropological.
That's what I meant to say.
Yes.
Thank you. That's very
you got
very
Star
different.
Fox on the
I did
mind.
have Star Fox on the red. So I think we agree, like in the broad strokes.
Yeah.
I think where I differ from you is that if you're thinking about Ocarina of Time again, I'm just gonna keep running back to Ocarina of Time.
It's an easy return point.
I think it's fine that the door has been closed in Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time, until generations of people die, including people I think in our generation, where there's still a ton of people our age who adore Ocarina of Time.
Yeah.
I'm one of those people. Until we're all gone, I think it's fine that Ocarina of Time just means what it means.
Okay.
And it has legacy that it has.
Okay.
To me, you got a game like Tears of the Kingdom.
Yes.
Prop comedy.
Boom, prop comedy. That's the first one we brought up.
To me, it's more useful to explore Tears of the Kingdom than it is to try to mine Ocarina of Time and find flaws in the foundation of its legacy. Because if we both come from the perspective...
I don't think it's the foundation that I'm analyzing. Sure. It's what's on top of that.
Well, I'll put it to you this way then.
Yeah.
If we both agree that the most important thing about games is how we experience them, to me, it doesn't really make much sense to say to all these people that grew up with Ocarina of Time, and they have that particular experience with the game, that's an invalid way to look at Ocarina of Time in retrospect.
Sure.
Ocarina of Time is a...
I don't ever want to claim that is an invalid way of looking at things. It's a way that I cannot look at the game, and most people cannot look at the game through that lens.
Yeah.
And so I think that in the balance of conversation, it seems that the core element of people who grew up with the game and played it when it came out, which is, again, a totally valid way to play the game, a very important way to play any game. I will feel the exact same way about Tears of the Kingdom because I played it when it came out.
Right.
It's not an invalid way, but I feel ends up dominating the conversation in a way that if you take the pool of people who have played Ocarina of Time, the group of people that played it at launch, near launch, are the people controlling the conversation around that game. And then the larger pool, and I'm not going to say how much bigger it is, 40 people maybe, that I think that larger pool goes maybe underserved in the conversation.
I think that that's probably true, but I guess I just don't really mind. And because think about games that we grew up with, right? Wii Sports Resort. I've already mentioned it, so I just mentioned it again. To people our age, especially big Nintendo fans, that game is very, very important.
Sure.
To people older than us, it really isn't. And I have to say, I don't really care what those people think about the game.
Fair enough, yeah.
In my opinion, the legacy of the game is one thing, right? But then that game, in my opinion, really is owned by the people who grew up with it.
Sure.
And I think that that's fine.
Yeah.
Again, because of the way I approach games. I'm really interested to hear about, even if it's for the 1 millionth time, somebody tell me about their experience playing Ocarina of Time in 1998. Because that's an experience that is gone now.
Yeah.
It's a memory in the past. And if we want to really understand the progression of games and we want to understand the different phases of the culture of the games, I think the most important thing we can do is learn from that moment by hearing from the people who are there.
Yeah, of course.
My experience with Ocarina of Time is, in some ways, intrinsically diluted.
Yeah.
Just by merit of playing it on Wii Virtual Console, playing on 3DS, playing it removed from the context, as you're saying, that's a natural progression of things.
Course.
But if we really want to get inside how people feel about games, how games make people feel at different times, I want to know from the people growing up with these games what they thought about them.
I agree. I think that is a very interesting part of the conversation around games, and it's one that I will be able to speak to and contribute to over time as I become the older gamer.
Yeah.
And I'm the one who grew up with launch era Minecraft, and that shaped the way that my taste in games. That is a core intrinsic part of conversation around games. I think where, again, it's really about conversation balance, in my opinion, and where I find more interest is not in hearing the largely same story of Ocarina of Time. I played it when I was a kid. It was the first 3D game. It felt like a Pixar world come to life. I couldn't believe that it was real. I've heard that story so many times.
Yeah.
I think it's more interesting, so let's put it in the context of Wii Sports, to hear from we're obviously far less removed from the launch of Wii Sports than we are our Wii Sports Resort, especially than from Ocarina of Time. But I'm more interested in, let's just say, 6 or 7 years to hear what the generation of kids that grew up outside of the Wii era context, they didn't play Wii Sports when it came out. Motion controls are largely gone. I'm interested to hear what they think of that game, revisiting it. And does it hold up in their experience? How is motion controls as someone that it wasn't a revolution for? That is the untold story. I think it's the untold story of Ocarina of Time to talk about someone playing Ocarina of Time after they played Breath of the Wild. And I could talk about that because I played it in that context, but I've never watched a video essay of someone talking about Breath of the Wild through the context of my first Zelda game was Breath of the Wild. And I'm interested in the untold stories, not the ones that, to me, this is generalization, but to me, feel set in stone because I've seen that already. I've read these stories. I've heard a similar point of view in all the magazines and all the articles and all the videos that I've watched over the course of a decade of digging into games culture and games history. I love doing it, but I'm more interested in the breadth of experience with a game rather than focusing on the one set of experiences that are obviously not all entirely similar. Everyone has their own perspective, but are a smaller part of the larger experience with any given game.
I guess I just think that, like, and you said something to me a long time ago that stuck with me, which is like, you want every sequel to be better than the previous thing because that pushes the industry forward or whatever.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like I can close my eyes and I can imagine somebody who is 12 who played Breath of the Wild when they were, I don't know, younger than 12, now playing Ocarina of Time. I kind of feel like if I was a betting man, I would say 9 times out of 10 they're not going to like the game.
Yeah.
And that feeds into what you explain of this idea of constantly changing standards in design or whatever. I guess to me, I'm like, well, do I really need to hear from somebody who's younger than me say, oh, I went back to Wii Sports and I thought it was boring?
Yeah.
I feel like no, because I kind of feel like we know that.
Okay, I'm a little bit confused though, because that's you. I understand you can make that assumption, and I think that's a fair assumption to make, and I would make the same assumption, but you don't know for sure because they have not told that story yet.
Yeah,
I can close my eyes, and 10 out of 10 times, someone who grew up with Ocarina of Time is going to tell the same story about Ocarina of Time.
Yeah,
and so if we're putting it through that lens of, I bet I can guess what this person would say. I don't think that on either side that is a valid way to think or to say that we shouldn't pursue that exploration of the conversation because you can say the exact same thing about people that played the game when they were growing up.
No, I think you're right, and I think I explained it badly.
It's totally fine.
I guess my thing is like, I feel like Ocarina of Time is just in the past now.
Yeah,
and
it's a link to the past.
And if we're thinking about the game, largely what you're after, I think, is a recontextualization of legacy.
Sure.
And to do that, I think you have to deviate from the opinion of the work for a
Okay.
large part. Like,
What does
if
that
you
mean?
want to recontextualize the legacy of Ocarina of Time,
Yeah.
you have to come to a different conclusion about Ocarina of Time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the only different conclusion to come to Ocarina of Time now is that Ocarina of Time isn't as good as it was.
Yeah.
And
I would say that.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like going by your idea that everything should just build on itself and get better and better and better. We already know that that's the case.
Yeah. Or sorry, what is?
We already know that it's the case that Ocarina of Time is to a new generation, to new people, not as good as it was.
I see. Yes.
And so when I'm trying to learn about games,
Yeah.
I'm trying to learn about what I can't see, feel, touch, experience.
Mm-hmm.
To your point, I agree with you. I can never wake up one day, put a calendar that says 1988 on my wall, 1998 on my wall, run downstairs
panel
to
your walls.
to a CRT,
Yeah.
plug in an N64, play Ocarina of Time, and be there in that moment. I can't do that. So to me, there's great value in hearing from the people who did.
Yeah.
And just because they might all reach the same conclusion of I loved Ocarina of Time,
Yeah, of course.
in hearing these stories that might be archetypal, there's a lot of variance in how that cartridge came to you, what part of the game spoke to you the most, various things that you're not going to get from a kid playing Ocarina of Time now.
Maybe not. I mean,
But my thing is the academic, for me, the academic value in that is much higher to learn from the old person than hear from the new person, because to me, games exist, as I've said, in this larger cultural context that's much beyond the quality of the game itself.
yeah, of course.
And so I guess my feeling is that we have a limited amount of time to hear from the people who loved Ocarina of Time in that moment we can never go back to. So I put a lot of stock in what they said because Ocarina of Time was a cultural moment. It was an evolution for games, and it was a really good game itself.
Yeah.
But I guess I just more heavily weigh when I'm thinking about game history what it was like to be there.
Well, and there's the catch.
Yeah.
That's thinking about it through the lens of game history.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to know what I love when I'm playing a game that has gone by the wayside.
Yeah.
Something like The Order 1886 or Drive Club. These are examples that from a previous version of this video that were going to be more relevant to the conversation. But hey, I'm able to bring them in. These are games that they didn't come out that long ago, but both of them are kind of gone to the annals of time. I mean, these games aren't particularly talked about. This is like the weird redheaded stepchild of Gran Turismo, and no one even knows what The Order 1886 is. And I've played both these games, and I actually like both these games. And one of my favorite parts of playing these games is going back and reading/listening to reviews at the time.
Yeah.
And I love doing that, and I love doing that with Ocarina of Time and things like that. I mean, going back and watching something like and not Angry Video Game Nerd, because obviously he does his own sort of thing, but like watching a completionist video where Gerard talks about how he played this game as a kid, and he has like little drawings of him as a kid opening the box and being so excited about it. Absolutely. I want those to be a part of the conversation, and they're a big part of the research and culture that I learn about with games. But I'm talking about games right now through, and why I wanted to bring up this conversation through that lens of the pre-launch, post-launch. In that post-launch is the bigger period of time, and it is the one that for most people weighs on their experience of a game. And I think, and obviously you would agree with this, opinions and taste in game design just do change over time. And I feel that those evolutions in taste, in technology, sometimes go under discussed. In a way that I think that there's real interesting academic, historical, and cultural value to analyze out of those. And when I say I would like to revisit the conversation of Super Metroid or Ocarina of Time, it's not because I think those are bad games. I've played both of them and I enjoy them. But because I don't think that there is enough conversation about, okay, Super Metroid comes out, inspires the Metroidvania genre, and especially in the last 10 years, the Metroidvania genre explodes. Indies, revisiting, Dread comes out, Prince of Persia's Lost Crown, the genre is now bigger than ever. Now that I have played Hollow Knight and Ori and Lost Crown and Dread, going back and taking a look at Super Metroid in the context of having played those games, what is the what, not historic value, but experiential value in what does it offer differently?
Yeah.
What does it do better, maybe, than some of the games that came before? What does it do worse? Where have the other games improved on that? And that, I think, is where the real meat of conversation is in that comparison. And for me, the willingness to be able to reevaluate and have the conversations of Ocarina of Time is considered one of the greatest games of all time.
Yeah.
If most people that play today don't think that it is better than Breath of the Wild, and Breath of the Wild has kind of become the de facto best game of all time, but if they play Ocarina of Time and most people play it and don't think that it's one of their favorite games of all time, or that X amount of games are better than it, is it actually one of the best games of all time?
Yeah.
Because if that's not shared by the consensus, then I don't think it's true. And so it's that evolution that I really find value in, rather than because really what I want is, in a perfect world, every year you poll every person about every game they've played and see how their opinions have changed on it year over year. Did you play a sequel that came out? Did you revisit it on older hardware or through emulation and feel that this doesn't quite hold up, or it does hold up? And then be able to, like, data brained, point that chart on a map where opinions change over time. And this is something I do for myself. And I feel I'm proud of myself for allowing myself this space. Is with my favorite movies of all time, my favorite games of all time, I make a best games of all time list, make a best movies of all time list. I lock that down. I move on. 1 year later, make a new version of that. See how that's changed. See which games have dropped off. Why have they dropped off? Which ones dropped 20 places because I played a game that was similar, but I think does something better. I find a lot of value in that evolution of discussion and opinion over time, because I think that is where the real value of conversation comes from, is putting things in the context of what the genuine context of what we're playing them in. It's like, I can't review Ocarina of Time in its launch context, because I am 23 years old and I played it on my 3DS and I played it on NSO. So that's the conversation I'm interested in, not only sharing but hearing other people's perspectives on, because as I was saying, I know what the set in stone opinion from 25 years ago was. I want to see what's next for that conversation.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I mean, but I also think, you're kind of approaching this larger thing about inventing and reinventing a canon of games, the best canon of games. Mm-hmm. If you're thinking of Super Metroid, for example, that's also my least favorite 2D Metroid. Sure. If you're not counting Metroid 1 or Metroid 2. Yeah.
Which are games that you haven't played extensively, but
no, not really.
Play them enough to know that you don't like them as much as.
I've played them enough to know that I don't like them at all. Yeah. But I love Super Metroid. I love Zero Mission instead of Metroid 1.
You played Metroid 1 last night in Nintendo World Championships NES edition.
I did do that. Like, what the fuck are you talking about?
And every time we played it, you're like,
yeah, I think that game is bad. But again, that's actually an interesting point. Yeah. I don't put much. And this might sound strange to you, but I don't put much stock in my opinion that Metroid 1 is bad. Okay. And the reason I don't do that is because I don't really care what people think of games on like a individual level. Sure. I'm happy to talk to somebody who loves the game I love, hates the game I love, and I'm trying to get better about not feeling any particular way about that.
It's not possible to entirely eliminate that.
No, of course not. Yeah. And it always annoys me to some extent. Yes. I'm like, you're wrong or whatever, right? Yes. But for the most part, to me,
welcome to conversation.
To me, again, it goes back to me feeling like an individual game is it's lacking. Mm-hmm. Even Tears of the Kingdom is a beautifully designed game. It's beautifully interesting, but to me, the game by itself is not as interesting as the game with everything else around it. Yeah. And so, I don't like Metroid 1, but so I want to go back and learn about why the conditions and context and what you need to enjoy Metroid 1. Yeah, sure. And that's really interesting and really important. And I think that it would be a shame to ever lose that. Sure. And that's why I like this historical context. Because if I'm thinking about games academically or whatever, thinking about them through the lens of how they impact people, I can always find new people to poll about their thoughts on Metroid 1. And that's cool. But I kind of feel like that's a whole different thing than what Metroid 1 was at the time, to the people at the time, to the industry at the time. Sure. And I just think that even if you want to weigh this other thing heavily, I just don't think it should ever weigh so heavily that we forget about
Yeah.
that what happened in the past, because we can never get that back. We can never recreate it, and so I think there's an urgency to make sure that that is preserved and
Sure.
not devalued.
Yeah.
For me, if anything, if you want to raise the value of this new interpretation,
Yeah.
that's great. But to me, I don't view it as an either or. And I don't view
No.
it as one over the other.
Of
If anything,
course.
it bring both pillars the same height.
Sure.
But for me, I will always have this pillar higher. I'll always have the historical pillar higher.
Yeah, I mean, well, so then it is okay to value one more than the other. Because
Yes.
you value the
Yeah.
older one more than the other.
Yeah, but I guess the best way to put it is I don't value one
You do. But that's okay. I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
Yeah, but what I'm saying, for me, what I'm trying to phrase, and I don't know the best way to phrase it, is
Yeah.
I'm not saying that one has, I think there's a difference between saying one has more value and one has less value. I think that they're both at like a high value, and then this one got like the bonus points.
Sure. Yeah, I would admit, okay. I would say that still means you value more.
Yeah.
Which means
I
that you
do
value the one less. Which means that it's okay to value one more than the other.
Yeah.
And I would value the newer one more than the other.
Sure.
Specifically because you're right.
Yeah.
Limited period of time. People who played it.
Yeah.
They're dying off in droves.
Right,
I
right.
believe coronavirus took out like 56% of them or something
Yeah.
like that. Look at the stats. And that's
Yeah.
a totally valid point. It's also true that same thing applies to every person who played every game at every point
Yeah.
of any game's life cycle, any art's life cycle.
Sure.
That is something I kind of just see that as a given. And I also think that where my value in where I want to pursue having conversations about
Yeah.
these games and doing research and bringing up voices is in the ones that haven't been talked to yet.
Sure.
In that you can read the reviews for Ocarina of Time or whatever game from EGM or Nintendo Power.
Yeah.
Well, the Nintendo Power ones are probably a little bit biased and probably edited by the company, but obviously historical context. You can read those. You can read the 20 years of IGN articles
Yeah.
and GameSpot articles and all these and the videos and documentaries and interviews with people. I think it's absolutely important to have
Yeah.
those documented in time, but I largely feel like they have.
Sure.
And so I feel that there is more value in, as I was saying, talking to voices and getting the perspectives that haven't been as thoroughly mined. And so that marching
Yeah.
forward, I think is important to make sure that we're pursuing the next step for these kinds of conversations.
And I mean, to be clear, I have a literal professional record of doing exactly that.
Yeah.
I mean, like you read through the Console Chronicles, and some of my favorite stories in that book that I commissioned were a story from a writer who grew up in Argentina when the Dreamcast was new,
Yeah.
and knew the Dreamcast through the lens of it being of like the bootleg and piracy scene in the country.
Yeah, very interesting.
I'm not saying that these voices aren't important,
Yeah.
and indeed, if you look at my body of work, it illustrates that I agree with you to that extent. I think that maybe and I'm also bringing in context of larger conversations we've had, different conversations we've
yes.
had. I just
A couple hundred BLB videos.
yes, what I'm advocating for right now is the I think everlasting importance of that historical context. The reason I was trying to, and I understand why you don't agree with it,
Yeah.
point of me valuing that more but not the other one less, is that I'm not trying to take away from what you're saying.
Sure.
I'm not trying to take away from the value of that
Yeah.
performance. If I was, I'd literally be turning my back on my own body of
Yeah,
work.
of course. Yeah. And now I want to put
Yeah.
another bit of important context.
Yeah.
I think I'm doing the exact same thing on the other side.
100%.
Yeah. And so we obviously just value the certain areas and
Yeah.
where we pursue these conversations and want to bring up the different voices or whatever in different areas. But I never want to tell someone who
Yeah.
grew up with X game that their value of it being new
Yeah.
and the memories of watching all the trailers and getting it on day one. That, of course, that's important.
Yeah.
and I don't want to squash it out of the industry or squash it out of the conversation. But I think it also just comes down to like the mindset of where we're approaching these things. Like, what sticks with you more? Is it for you the fact that the voices are dying off or whatever? I'm paraphrasing. And so it's important to pursue them, and that's where your focus lies.
Yeah.
That's where your mindset lies. Or for me, when I see that pool of conversation, what I noticed is that that area has been thoroughly mined, and so then I notice where else can I go? So I'm not retreading the same ground from before.
I'd also put it to you this way. Like, I'll keep using an example of the Console Chronicles just because I think it makes my point really well. When I was commissioning that book, I'm looking for people who had a similar experience with different things in different times. So what I mean to say is
Multiple articles in like the same game? Or?
No.
Okay.
What I mean to say is when I'm talking about something newer, I'm getting a younger writer in. I'm getting their experience growing up, which echoes the experience of that person who grew up with the NES.
Yeah.
Where I come at it is that this historical ingrained perspective is exactly the same as the new perspective, but in a different era.
Absolutely true. 100% true.
And so that's why, to me, I'm putting legacy somewhere different.
Sure.
The legacy of a game is its position when it released. It's what it influenced. Its new ideas it had. It was those objective qualities.
The historical context.
The historical context. And to me, that's always going to exist separately. I think even if everybody has a revolt in Ocarina of Time and suddenly a hated game, it'll be unimpeachable.
Call me Napoleon Bonaparte, you know what I'm saying?
It'll be unimpeachable that Ocarina of Time
had that legacy,
and still has that legacy. It will always have that legacy. It will never be a past tense thing. Every time
it might be.
Well, what I mean to say is, as long as Ocarina of Time is a thing that exists, it will always hold the status of inventing Z targeting. It'll always hold the status of those things. That can never be taken away from it. What I value is allowing people the space to talk about games as they formed them.
Sure.
And then looking at these older people were formed by this set of games. And had this experience with them. Intriguingly, this younger set of people was formed by this set of games. And the experiences look very similar. The nouns are just different. The game is different. The year is different. The hardware is different.
But the experience is largely mirrored. And that's something that I'm really interested to get to the point of. And of course, that's a sliding scale. It's always happening to some degree. But in some sick, twisted way, I am more interested in hearing, as I was saying, 6 or 7 years from now, hearing these stories of kids that are a decade younger than me, what their experience playing whatever game it is as their first game.
Sure.
I cannot wait to hear the stories that are similar to, oh man, I'm thinking a lot of this recently. Pokemon is a really interesting example in that Pokemon has a very sliding scale of who is a fan of certain games, and it ebbs and flows, and it largely tracks with what games you started with and which one shaped your perspective. But I remember hearing on some podcast the other day about how unfortunate it is that the internet has taken away so much of the mystery of games.
Sure.
And that it used to be that on the playground you're telling your friends, like, oh, if you push the truck and there's Mew underneath or whatever. And that there were these secrets, and that missing no was this crazy thing. And what I can only confirm from my generation, but I can hypothetically confirm for the next generation, is that you're right. These experiences are largely mirrored. And that the internet, I don't think, because it didn't for me, and I think there's a solid chance that it hasn't for the younger people, hasn't taken away that mystery of, you can easily imagine, and I think I probably have heard, maybe just don't have specific examples, of hopping into Sword and Shield as your first Pokemon game, or Scarlet and Violet, a world with a massive map and lots of caves and nooks and crannies and species you might not know how to discover, or something like with Sword and Shield, the fact that you have to be at a certain point of the map with a Galarian Yamask to evolve it into a Runerigus. That is, if you're 9 years old and that's your first Pokemon game, and your friend tells you, if you take your Yamask to this point of the map and you level it up in this area and it evolves into this really cool Pokemon that's not the same Pokemon as it used to evolve into, that's a mystery. That's amazing, and it's the exact same kind of parallel experience that I'm always interested in chasing that next step for. And so I totally agree with that.
And let me jump on that for a second, actually. And this is why I defend the sort of universal opinion, I guess, to a certain extent. And just let me get this out of the way out.
Totally fine.
If you're a kid and you're 8, or let's say you're 19, you've just started college, you're getting really you're like me, you're doing film and new media studies, you're writing a lot about games. You're like Tucker, you're doing film and new media studies, and you're writing about games. No. I don't think, or to me, I don't get much value out of that person going back to Pokemon Red and Blue and saying Pokemon Red and Blue is bad because of A, B, C, and D. The reason I don't is because I find it equally wrong for somebody who grew up with Red and Blue to look at Sword and Shield, Scarlet and Violet, and say, "Oh, this is bad because da 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 da." They've compromised the core of Pokemon. So the reason I try to let the people with whom the game that grew up with the game tell the story of that game is because I think we're all telling a similar story.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that there is a value from a point of view of looking at the game by itself and finding its objective quality in having new people go and attack old games or old people attack new games, whatever.
Yeah.
But I just think that for me, the value is not the same as when you have all of the pieces of the puzzle. And maybe I'm becoming a boomer, but when people are like, "Oh, Mario, if you're a little kid, Mario Galaxy is boring," whatever. Or when my older
or if
friends,
you're my age.
or if you're one of my older friends saying, "Oh, all these games are just as they're not, Super Mario Odyssey is so boring. It's nowhere near as good as Mario 64." I'm like, you gotta let me have this one, and I'm gonna let you have that one, and we can talk about these two games, but I could never give the I'm going to use the word authority, although you might disagree with that. The cultural authority to discuss Mario 64, that person who grew up in the 90s has it, and I don't have it. Now, I can come and say, I don't like Mario 64 for all these reasons, and I'm happy to do that because I don't like Mario 64
They
all
have
that
the
much.
N64 pass.
But I guess I just feel like, again, because I approach games through the lens of how they touched people, to me, I want to hear the story of how they touch somebody fully and how they touch them with all these elements in mind.
No, absolutely.
And it's again, it's not about just upholding the old people. It's not letting the old people, the olds, come to us. They got to stay over there, right?
Well, yeah, and I obviously agree with that to a certain extent as well. I found it quite, I guess, invalidating to be playing a game like Pokemon X or Sun and Moon, and those being some of my favorite games of all time, and I think I can make a pretty good case for them being some of the best of the series. From my perspective, of a guy who was there watching those trailers as they came out, that prefers the collecting over the battling. You have to do all these things that put me into the context of why I like those games.
Yeah.
And seeing the, oh man, Sun and Moon is just they lost the spark and they're so easy and hand holding and the cutscenes take away from the essence of the adventure or whatever it is. I found it invalidating to do that. And the unfortunate reality is that we're all playing different sides of this at all times.
Yeah.
There are games you like that other people love that when you say this is bad for this reason, someone else feels the exact same way you do when they say about your game, yada yada yada. What I think was interesting is that what I disagree with, and I think you were saying this more for comedic effect, is the you should stay over there thing. I think that the puzzle is what you were talking about. Having all the pieces, I think, is most important. And for me, the reality of how many pieces there are is that there are a lot less discovered pieces of people that don't like the game, didn't grow up with the game, than the ones that did. The pieces we have put down on the conversation about Super Metroid is that people grew up with it, they loved it, invented a genre, it has stayed around this legacy, and people revisit it on NSO, or they revisit it on the Super Nintendo Classic, and they still love it. Those are the core pieces of the puzzle. But if you want the whole puzzle, you have to reach out to someone like me that played Ori and the Blind Forest first, and goes back to Super Metroid 3 years later, and feels like it's a little bit clunky, and that.
Well, because it is.
Yes, that feels like it's clunky, and that parentheses derogatory. And that adds another piece to the puzzle, and that the puzzle of a game like Fortnite isn't that a huge generation of kids grew up with it and it shaped their taste of games. That is the core of that puzzle. But the outskirts of that puzzle are you trying it for a couple times and being like, yeah, okay, I like this element of it. I don't like this element of it. The way that it brings in IPs or whatever, I find that a little bit annoying, but I enjoy it in certain areas. Or the people that take a more critical approach to that game that largely are older than us. Of course, there are people across all the age spectrums that are critical of Fortnite, but that this game is ruining the industry and that loot boxes and microtransactions and free-to-play are brainwashing the kids or whatever. That's still a piece of that puzzle. And so to complete the puzzle, which is a puzzle that's not possible to be completed, but to have a more informed picture of what culture has thought of X game, it is important for me to reach out and discover the pieces that have yet to be placed down on the board. And I think, and I have to be completely honest, it's I'm interested in pursuing these conversations and putting these pieces on the board because I'm part of those pieces that haven't been put on the board. Of course, I'm putting myself on the board. I'm making the videos. I'm writing the Discord. I'm writing the backlogged reviews. But I want my piece to be on the board. I want my piece of, I played Breath of the Wild before Ocarina of Time, and honestly, Ocarina of Time's not that impressive. Like, Z-targeting doesn't blow my mind because I've Z-targeted in 300 games. Obviously, that it's not an invalid experience to have grown up with that, and Z-targeting is so cool, and Hyrule Field is so cool. That's not invalid at all. It's also not invalid to have played 300 games, open world games before Ocarina of Time, and then you go to Hyrule Field and like, where's the stuff? To me, it's less interesting. That's one of the pieces to still put on the board. And so, and frankly, it's like I want to see my opinion reflected, and I want to see other people who share my same opinion reflected. And I feel that because I exist in this interesting middle ground, where, as you were saying, I share the common opinion, but I do not share the common opinion that is in print media. That is in the Ninty Freshes and things like that. These and that are being talked about on IGN and on podcasts hosted by people 20 years older than me. I lost my train of thought.
No,
I think you understand where I was going with it.
And let me put my bias out there, too. I don't give a fuck what anybody thinks about Ocarina of Time.
Yeah.
I don't care what anybody thinks about Ocarina of Time. What I care about is the moment of Ocarina of Time.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, just if that's your perspective that other people don't share with you, I think the perspective that I hold that other people don't share with me is that I'm just simply not interested in what most people think of Ocarina of Time.
Fair enough.
I'm barely interested in what I think of Ocarina of Time. I wrote a piece about Ocarina of Time a number of years ago.
And now I'm too interested in both.
Yeah, and to lay it out, I wrote a piece a couple years ago for Retroware, may it rest in peace, where I talked about how, to me, it was not the pinnacle of gaming anymore. For reasons citing along the lines of what you're saying about changing standards of interactivity and this, that, and the third, it's not this pinnacle anymore. But I still really like that game.
Yeah.
But I guess it all comes back to the fact that I'm only interested in looking at games through two perspectives. One, am I having fun with this thing?
Yes.
And if the answer is no, I'm done with it.
Yeah.
Or two, what did it mean for the picture of larger gaming culture? Mm-hmm. I'm not really interested in the game itself in terms of how people think about it now or for its own internal quality.
Okay.
My interest in gaming is all about how we all took different paths at different times through the industry, and different games touched our lives in different ways. And to me, I guess I just, if somebody who's picking up any game for the purposes of going for its quality, either in support or an attack of it,
sure.
To me, I just don't.
Both are allowed?
Both are perfectly allowed. I just don't, as someone interested in charting games culture.
Yeah.
I'm just not really interested in that. In this game by its own design merits is actually overrated or was perfectly rated. I guess what I'm always curious about is the games that touched and shaped people's lives.
Absolutely.
And I just don't think that Ocarina of Time can shape our lives.
No, definitely.
And it couldn't. I got it on 3DS. I really like that game. I've played it a number of times. Only once to completion all the way, but I played it a lot across my whole life. It's been a consistent game that I've played, thought about, written about. It in no way, shape, or form defines my life. And I think it's because I agree with your original premise that I can never go back to the moment when it could have.
Exactly, yeah.
So to me, Ocarina of Time is always going to exist as this thing that I enjoy. But to me, it's always going to belong to somebody else. And I guess that's why I'm just curious in them. And that does not always mean I want the homogenized opinion. Like I said, I love this piece that I commissioned about Dreamcast as this bootleg system. But again, that was somebody whose life was shaped and defined by Dreamcast. I never would have wanted to commission a piece from me, even given myself the green light to write a piece about why I think the Dreamcast is overrated, because the Dreamcast doesn't hold a significance in my life.
Also, you've barely played any Dreamcast games.
Yeah, this is largely a hypothetical example.
I know.
That to me doesn't spark joy, and I think it's just about what sparks joy. Is this? Assault is just the word coming to mind,
That's
but
fine.
it's not.
I love assault.
This assault on.
Unless it's. No, wait, never mind.
this assault on the old guard to continue to use this war metaphor of games, of the status of games. To me, that doesn't spark joy. What sparks joy is...
Sometimes it might spark some little annoyance when I start doing it, yeah.
What sparks joy is learning about how how any game was pivotal to somebody's life. And I think if it wasn't pivotal to your life, that opinion just doesn't weigh the same for me, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. 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 Do you have any other questions for me to flesh out what I...
Yeah, what color underwear are you wearing?
Blue.
Nice. Gray?
Gray. Like a bruise.
I don't really. I mean, I think that ultimately this discussion is not what it began as, but I think it's useful because it's a discussion that's basically been plaguing the entire BLB server discourse for years and years at this point. So I think it's very compelling all the same. And we ultimately both... neither of our love of games is stronger than the others, I wouldn't say.
Yeah.
And we...
Well, one is, but I'm not pointing his fingers in.
We just appreciate games differently.
Yeah.
And I think that we both appreciate it with the same level of seriousness, even though our opinions are kind of at cross purposes.
Yeah.
I don't think either of us are really at odds with the overarching mission of wanting to have a better understanding of
Yeah. And obviously games. The reality is you want people with the different perspectives not only on the games but about asking people about the games and what avenues of the conversation.
Yeah.
You want you want me.
Yeah.
I know you do. To be coexisting in this space to make sure that all the bases are covered, because if we only had you writing books, there'd be a big part of people that weren't being interviewed.
Exactly.
And if you had me writing books, you wouldn't get a very good book because I never read a book before.
And if somebody came and wrote I just feel like if someone wrote about the Wii U instead of me, it wouldn't be the same as me explaining that experience that I had with it.
Sure.
Because it shaped my life, it didn't shape an older person's life. Again, that's why I keep hammering on this valuing more, not valuing less, which I understand at a certain point is not logical, but because what you're saying there is way more than time and place for. There's ultimate time and ultimate place for what you're explaining.
What?
Like, I don't want to
I just had that fucking, like, Doctor Strange pushed me through multiple dimensions. What the fuck just happened?
Like, I'm not I don't want the takeaway to be that just because I think that this is more important in my mind, these talking from the position of what touched your life, I don't think that you shouldn't still investigate the quality of games, because as artistic pieces, they deserve that too. Yeah. I think I'm just less interested in the artistry as what that artistry meant to people in their own particular
And obviously
lives.
Reflected in the last video that we made that lost us 12 subscribers, and you saying video games aren't hard. I fucking hate that. Apparently. I didn't watch it.
Yeah, no, that's it. I hate games, and I think that they are not worth anyone's time, and you're a child if you play them.
Well, the interesting closing thought is is about how I view the discussion of art. I think that the reality is in that, and that everyone who grew up with X movie, X game, whatever, has passed away, or because it's been a long enough time for that to happen, or because I'm personally invested in it, or because someone I know is personally invested in it. Everyone who grew up for watching every new movie. It's reflected in my hunger game showcase, because I'm interested in what watching every. Doesn't mean that I'm not interested in the history or what came before, because the context in which a game came out, and pushing the context when it came out, and also pushing of a heart and a mind as I can, but also to stretching towards that inevitable reevaluation of any piece of art in any given time. I honestly think that there's no one piece of art in any medium that will always be the top of its medium. Yeah. And whether that is 500 years from now, no one gives a fuck about the Mona Lisa. It's possible. It's unlikely, but it's possible. And I think especially with games, Mona Lisa, bad example. Very likely that people will care about the Mona Lisa in 500 years. Let's revisit this conversation by saying, especially, I think it's important for the games medium because it's only been around for 45, 50 years. And there hasn't been 300, 500, 800 years of games like there has been with music and with painting and things like that to see which ones stand the test of time. We have games that have stood the test of 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, and some of them have stayed, some of them have dipped down. But I'm sure there were Renaissance paintings that were painted around the side of the Mona Lisa that were considered some of the best paintings of all time for 500 years, and then nobody talks about it anymore. And that's perfectly fine. That's how the evolution of this, of any conversation about a medium works. And games, I think, because they're so young, I see this as the primordial stages. And for me, and this is not something that I have a particular value in any other mediums for, I guess, film, the primordial stages are for that knocking things down and figuring out what works and seeing what ends up staying that long period of time. There's a reason why the first songs that were made aren't considered the best songs that were ever made. But games are still new enough to where games 15 years after the medium was invented are considered some of the greatest games of all time. And I don't think that will stay forever because just looking at the track record of how conversational art evolves over time, it seems inevitable. Obviously, I don't know that for a fact, but I'm interested in and I guess it sounds reductive or a little bit assaulty, but in that I think it's a natural course of things to be replaced and to stretch for that next thing. And so I critique Ocarina of Time not because it's not a great game in its own merit, not because it wasn't important for its time, not because it didn't touch people, but because I'm the younger guy. I'm going to be around for longer. I'm going to be shaping the conversation for longer, and I have my opinion on that game. And I want to make sure that people know that Ocarina of Time is the greatest game of all time is not Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time is a bigger game that includes a bubble of people like myself that played it after Breath of the Wild and were depressed by it. And that evolution is natural and I think very important to watching what happens over time. And if I come back to me in 500 years, if Ocarina of Time is still in the top 10 of greatest games of all time in the year 2665, then I'll be wrong. That's totally fine. But I don't know, it's an okay game, and I want to make sure people know I think it's an okay game. If that makes sense.
It definitely does.
So anyway, again, check in this video in a couple hundred years, see how right I am. Once Ocarina of Time is as old as the Mona Lisa is now, then we'll know if I'm right or not.
Sounds good.
I set very, very, very high bars for myself.
You do.
To the point where, who knows? I don't know. I'll never know.
No, you will not.
See you guys in another video. So I'm going to be saying something along the lines of, everyone, Tucker Hazel back and banter.
Yeah, you can start with that. It's a good place to start.
What do you think? Let's run that by our people.
All right.